program, get a better return for the taxpayer, and in the end, truly shut down an outdated federal program. These are all wins, and we should pass this bill and celebrate these successes. So I urge adoption of the resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
And I will yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
While the process of moving this legislation forward has taken some time, it has also demonstrated that members of both parties, members of both houses, can work cooperatively and in good faith to reach bipartisan solutions. This is the sort of legislative action Americans want to see us undertaking. The legislation before us is a version that none of us would write if left to our own devices. Every member who has worked on this bill, every stakeholder affected by this bill has had to make compromises to achieve a shared goal of maintaining the supply of helium that is important. We've had to make substantive changes to address legitimate policy concerns. We've had to make technical changes to address parliamentary and budget matters. But we've gotten the job done. I wish we could use this as a model for the continuing resolution, for the debt ceiling, for the Farm Bill, for so many other things. With the clock ticking, the need to get this legislation across the finishing line is urgent. As I said when we considered this bill back in April, helium is not used just to fill balloons. It is critical for MRI, magnetic resonant imaging machines. It is necessary for preparing NASA rockets for launching, for high-tech manufacturing such as cleaning silicon chips for integrated circuits, and for lots of important scientific research. For many of these applications, there is simply no replacement for helium. Our nation's federal helium reserve supplies nearly half of the helium used in the United States and roughly a third of all the helium used globally. If Congress fails to pass this legislation by Monday, the end of the current fiscal year, the Interior Department's authority to continue operating the reserve will expire. If this is allowed to happen, nearly half of America's helium would be cut off, creating a crisis, and that's not an overstatement, that would devastate important sectors of America's high-tech and medical economy. H.R. 527 would extend the life of the Federal Helium Reserve past the end of this fiscal year and ensure a fair return to taxpayers on this federally owned resource. It would generate more than $300 million for American taxpayers, according to the Congressional Budget Office. I thank Chairman Hastings, also former Ranking Member Markey and current Ranking Member DeFazio. They deserve enormous credit for moving this legislation forward. It's a good bill, provides a workable solution to a real problem, and I urge its adoption. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank the Speaker, and I thank the Chairman of the House Resources Committee for his leadership on this and many other issues so important to America's economy and our country. I rise today also in support of this legislation to reform the federal helium program and also to reduce the deficit by $90 million over the next decade. As Chairman of the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, I realize this is not about balloons. This is about America's great innovation and technology sector, about computers, and as we heard from my colleague from New Jersey, MRIs, and our great innovation and technology. It's essential that this become law. At the same time, this measure also provides short-term help to rural communities from some of the funding sources here. And those communities are teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. But let's be clear, that help is a lifeline, not a lifeboat. The status quo of asking Uncle Sam for a check year after year is simply not sustainable. However, managing our federal forests, generating jobs and revenue, that's sustainable. Last week, the House passed a long-term solution for our rural forested communities, H.R. 1526, the Chairman's bill, the Healthy Forests for the Healthy Communities Act. And now it's time for the United States Senate to take positive action. We need to create jobs in the woods. We need to reduce the threat of wildfire, catastrophic wildfire. We need to improve the health of our watersheds and our forests. We need to help our forested communities get back to self-sufficiency, self-reliance, get people back to work in the woods. The clock's ticking. It's time to get this done. Rural communities cannot wait any longer. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Connecticut.
Gentlelady from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague, Mr. Holt, for giving me a moment today. I rise to thank Chairman Hastings, Ranking Member DeFazio, and all the other members in the House and in the Senate who are involved in resolving the helium reserve issue. While Americans are rightfully frustrated with gridlock in Washington, gridlock and posturing that right now is threatening a government shutdown and damage to our economy, today we are voting on a negotiated path forward, a more fair solution that will ensure a stable supply of helium for businesses and will reduce our deficit by an estimated $90 million over the next 10 years. From the beginning of the discussion over the future of the Helium Stewardship Act this year, I've taken a keen interest in the issue as helium is a linchpin for Connecticut's economy. From refiners like Praxair to end users like hospitals and manufacturers, the health of the helium market supports thousands of jobs in my state. Once again, I want to thank Chairman Hastings for working with everyone at the table to make some last-minute changes to address legitimate and justified concerns. This sort of bipartisan, respectful cooperation and compromise is just what our country needs and just what our country wants. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Dent, who has been actively involved in this legislation since actually the issue came to fore a little over a year ago. So I yield him 3 minutes.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, too, rise in strong support today of this legislation. I also wanted to extend my thanks to Chairman Hastings, to Mr. Holt, to the Ranking Member DeFazio and the former Ranking Member Senator Markey, all for their leadership, as well as our friends in the Senate, Senators Wyden and Murkowski. This is truly an example of a good bipartisan piece of legislation done in a bicameral manner. I think we can all take pride in the fact that Congress can actually get things done when we put our minds to it. While I had some reservations regarding the initial House bill, due to some potential issues of potential contract violations, this bill before us, H.R. 527, fairly addresses those concerns, and I tried to address those concerns in the previous bill, and I also want to thank Ms. Esty and Mr. Higgins from New York for their strong support in that effort. But again, passing this legislation will ensure continued access to the nation's helium supply for American businesses and researchers. As has been stated, if no action is taken before October 1st, the Bureau of Land Management will be forced to shutter the federal helium reserve, putting at risk thousands of jobs of hardworking Americans, particularly those in the manufacturing sector. A steady supply of helium is absolutely essential in manufacturing items such as MRI scanners, computer chips, fiber optic cables, and so we need to make sure that we can continue in those pursuits. Also, it's important to many refiners, like in my district, Air Products and Chemicals, in Ms. Esty's district, Praxair, Linde, and others who are also very much involved with making sure this helium gets to the marketplace and to the end users. Today's action will ensure that these advanced and high-tech manufacturers will not lose access to over 1/3 of global supply of helium at a time when a helium shortage is already in place. Again, I want to say thanks to everybody involved, Mr. Holt, Mr. Hastings, for their patience, for listening, and for coming up with a very good solution to a very important problem. So thank you, and at this time I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Let me ask the chairman if he has additional speakers.
I am prepared to close, and the gentleman is prepared to close.
Then I will close with a few remarks.
The gentleman is recognized.
With thanks to the chairman. Mr. Speaker, I just want to stress how important the operation of the Federal Helium Reserve has been to science, to technology, to manufacturing, to health care in the United States. 3/4 of a century ago, far-sighted legislators began stockpiling helium, thinking it might be used for dirigibles and blimps, lighter than aircraft. They didn't really know what else it would be used for, but they recognized and understood that helium had some very special properties. Additionally, the Federal Helium Reserve, the country's domestic stockpile of helium, has been a good investment for taxpayers. Helium is without a doubt a rare, valuable resource critical to our economic and national security. Because of decisions by Congress in past years, we're now in a position where failure to act in the next 5 days will result in nearly half of Americans' helium supply being cut off, creating a crisis in health care and research and manufacturing and many other areas. So here we have an example of where Congress was far-sighted and then subsequently short-sighted. Today, I think we are taking wise steps to remedy the situation. It's important that as we make the decisions and the changes that we make with this legislation, that we don't fail to recognize the possible future uses, many perhaps not envisioned, and a possible failure of the market to provide an adequate supply of helium to meet those demands. I know there's an ideology that's prevalent around here that for any economy, for any human need, the market will provide. In fact, it doesn't always. In this case, in the helium over the decades, it would not have, had it not been for the Federal Reserve. So it's important today that as we're passing this legislation, we remember that it does require, within 2 years, the development of a long-term helium strategy to secure access to helium and to minimize disruption of a helium supply once the current reserve is shut down. The Federal Helium Reserve, over the life of this bill, will generate over $300 million for American taxpayers. Now, Mr. Speaker, the definition of a good investment is something that returns considerably more than you put into it. The Helium Reserve has been a good investment for this country. And frankly, the federal government should be looking for more opportunities to make such investments. If in a few years' time we realize that a federal helium reserve is necessary to secure a long-term domestic supply of helium, then I hope we can work together in the same cooperative manner that we worked on this to make the far-sighted investments that legislators made many decades ago to establish a federal helium reserve. I thank my colleagues on the committee and especially my friend from Washington State, Chairman Hastings, for his work on this bipartisan solution. I encourage my colleagues to here and the other body to get this to the President for his signature quickly. I urge adoption, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, virtually all my colleagues have expressed gratitude for this bipartisan, bicameral effort, and I want to add my words to that also. But I particularly want to thank two members of the House Natural Resources staff, Tim Charters and Mandy Tharp, because they worked diligently on this, and especially this last week, getting the final language together. It's not often that you get to thank one person that has served in both bodies, but former Ranking Member Ed Markey was a co-sponsor originally of 527, and now Senator Markey was a big advocate over in the Senate, and I want to thank him and his staff. I particularly want to thank, again, Senator Wyden and Senator Murkowski and their staff, because we recognized earlier on that this had to be done before a date certain. And obviously, as we've said many times on this floor, there are differences between the two bodies and how they approach different issues. And that was certainly true with this one. But we knew we had to get this done, and so we have a piece now that I think both sides and both houses can agree on. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I urge adoption of the resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 354? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the gentleman from Washington is recognized.
The Speaker asks for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2600.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2600, a bill to amend the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act to clarify how the Act applies to condominiums.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, and the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and submit extraneous material for the record on H.R. 2600 currently under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consent.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I want to begin by commending my colleague, Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney of New York, for introducing H.R. 2600 in an effort to clarify the intent and purpose of the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act, or ILSA. ILSA was signed into law almost a half-century ago to regulate fast buck operators who were bilking investors, especially the elderly, through blatantly fraudulent sales of raw land, often located in swamps and deserts. It was land sales, not condo units, which were the intended target of the ILSA disclosures, which is quite evident in the fact that the required disclosures relate to land issues, such as access to roads and water supply, and make no sense in the context of more urban vertical developments. Nevertheless, in the 1980s, the federal court started to apply ILSA to vertical condominiums based on HUD's broad interpretation and Congress's failure to expressly exempt condominiums. The fact is, purchasers of vertical condominium units do not need the additional disclosures of that act. To the extent that any of these, the Act's disclosures relate to condo developments, they are generally duplicative of more extensive information already contained in state-mandated disclosures to purchasers. Private use of ILSA was practically non-existent for 40 years until 2008, when the real estate market crashed and purchasers' lawyers started looking for ways to escape pre-crash contracts. As the recession continued, plaintiffs' lawyers began seeking out purchasers' clients to file lawsuits under that act, demanding full rescission of contracts with such websites as nocondo.com. Courts generally acknowledge that the ILSA has become, quote, an increasingly popular means of channeling buyers' remorse. But while courts have expressed sympathy for the developer's position, many courts have felt compelled to apply the language of the statute literally, allowing buyers to escape valid contracts. Therefore, I stand in strong support of H.R. 2600, which put an end to the exploitation of ILSA and allow residential condominium sales to make a return to the marketplace. And I want to urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I want to once again commend my colleague on the Financial Services Committee, both for her great legislative work, but her thoughtfulness in crafting this legislation, and I reserve the balance.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlelady is recognized.
And I thank my colleague from the Financial Services Committee, Mr. McHenry. This is one of many bills that we have worked together on in a bipartisan way. The Interstate Land Sales Disclosure Act, known as ILSA, was enacted in 1969 to protect consumers from being cheated in land deals. It was originally intended to protect out-of-state buyers who were sold land that was not what it was advertised to be, and provides a right of action to rescind the contract and walk away from the deal. However, due to ambiguities in the original law, courts have ruled over the years that ILSA applies to condominiums, and developers are required to file redundant paperwork and make disclosures that are completely nonsensical when applied to condo units. This has led to absurd results. For example, ILSA requires condo developers to file a report that discloses, among other things, information about the condo's unit's topography, how much of the condo is covered by water, and whether there is any soil erosion, and whether the condominiums have any oil and gas rights. I for one, don't know of any high-rise condo units that are covered by water. Requiring condo developers to file these types of nonsensical disclosures provides no consumer protection whatsoever and simply generates unnecessary paperwork. Unfortunately, during the economic downturn in 2008, some buyers have used the recording requirements of ILSA to rescind otherwise valid contracts for economic reasons, an unintended consequence of the Act and its intent. The law now needs a technical fix to distinguish condominium sales from other types of land sales and to recognize the unique conditions under which these units are sold in today's market. As the author of the Credit Card Holders Bill of Rights, I am a strong supporter of consumer protections. I fully support the consumer protections that were enacted through ILSA, and this proposed legislation does nothing to affect those consumer protections. But I also believe that we need to make distinctions for condos in order to allow the condominium development industry to rebound from the recession. The bill would only exempt condos from ILSA's registration requirements. It will maintain the consumer protection, which ensure that consumers still have the right to rescind contracts in cases of actual fraud. Developers would, of course, still be required to comply with state laws that require specific disclosures. As we recover in this still very fragile economy, we want to encourage, not discourage, buyers and sellers to enter into real estate deals responsibly. That is why this bill is important to ensure development and the return of an important industry in our country, residential condominium sales. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
We're prepared to close.
I yield 5 minutes to my distinguished colleague from the great state of New York.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague from New York, Ms. Maloney, for bringing this important issue to the floor today and for yielding me the time. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 2600, a common-sense clarification to the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act, ILSA, to preserve consumer protections while keeping our economic recovery on track. More than 40 years ago, Congress passed ILSA to prevent real estate developers from bilking unsuspecting buyers out of their life savings by selling them parcels of land in the middle of a swamp or of a desert. ILSA requires sellers to disclose critical information about the land being sold, including automobile access to the property, the availability of water on a lot, and access for emergency personnel. These disclosure requirements are clearly necessary and appropriate for individuals buying land sight unseen. They do not make sense, however, when you try to apply them to purchases of condominiums in urban high-rise developments. Clearly, a condo in downtown Manhattan or in downtown Dallas will have access to water and emergency services, and purchasers do not need to know about the risk of soil erosion or the presence of mobile homes within their unit on the 15th floor. Although common sense would dictate otherwise, courts have interpreted the vague statutory and regulatory language of ILSA to apply to condo purchases. While that interpretation has been disputed and discussed over the years, ILSA was rarely an issue in private condo sales until the economy collapsed in 2008. And as mentioned by Ms. Maloney, facing tough financial times and underwater mortgages, many condo and co-op buyers began to use the developer's failure to comply with ILSA to void otherwise valid contracts for condo purchases and receive a full refund in their pre-cash down payment. These suits slowed the housing recovery and left many large developments in New York, Florida, and other states unfinished or unoccupied. We can all agree that ILSA provides vital consumer protection for land purchasers, but the law should not be used to void valid contracts because of buyer's remorse. The bill before us today provides a simple clarification to explicitly exempt condominium sales from the law's disclosure requirements. To ensure that ILSA continues to provide the highest level of consumer protection, condominium developers will still be required to comply with the law's anti-fraud provisions. Developers will also be required to continue complying with all state and local disclosure requirements for condominiums. This bill, Mr. Speaker, is an easy fix to ensure developers continue to comply with strict reporting requirements, purchasers have the information they need to make informed decisions, and their economic recovery remains on track. I congratulate Ms. Maloney for bringing this bill to the floor. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
From New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further requests for time, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill, H.R. 2600? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
I ask for a recorded vote.
Does the gentleman ask for the yeas and nays?
I do indeed.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, proceedings will resume on motions to suspend the rules previously postponed. Votes will be taken in the following order. H.R. 1961 by the yeas and nays. H.Res. 354 by the yeas and nays. The first electronic vote will be conducted as a 15-minute vote. The remaining electronic vote will be conducted as a 5-minute vote. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman of Wisconsin, Mr. Petri, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1961, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 127, H.R. 1961, a bill to amend Title 46, United States Code, to extend the exemption from the fire retardant materials construction requirement for vessels operating within the boundary line.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
Two votes in this series, this one on a bill that extends until 2028 an exemption from fire retardant standards for certain vessels, which, according to a summary in Congressional Quarterly, would allow the steamboat Delta Queen to operate once again. The Senate today voted unanimously to advance the House bill that would defund the health care law and keep the federal government operating through mid-December. The Senate now has up to 30 hours of debate before a vote is expected to remove the health care language from the funding bill. And there are several steps after that for the Senate to complete work on the continuing resolution. But once the Senate has finished work on it, the House will take it up. A couple of tweets. The Hill sending a tweet quoting Senator David Vitter, saying that the House could pass a one-week funding bill. And HuffPost Politics sent a tweet a few minutes ago that says House Republicans unlikely to touch Obamacare in their next offer to fund the government. We talked with a Capitol Hill reporter about what's ahead.
Lisa Mascaro is congressional correspondent for Tribune's Washington Bureau. The Senate today moved forward with the continuing resolution funding the federal government past September 30th. What happened in today's vote? Any surprises there, and what's next?
Yeah, hi. Well, I think probably the most interesting thing out of today's vote was that it was one of those rare unanimous votes in the Senate. You had 100 senators all agreeing to go ahead and move forward on this bill. So, you know, that was interesting because you don't always see those round numbers in the Senate, but it did happen. I think what it showed is there's a real eagerness for the senators to get going on this and dispatch with this. Now, of course, Senator Ted Cruz had his all-night, round-the-clock talkathon. That came to a close this morning. You know, sort of the filibuster that maybe was or wasn't a filibuster. But what we have now, the Senate is in this sort of 30-hour time period where they are actually getting ready to vote to proceed to the bill. The big question right now is whether all the senators will hold firm to continue having this 30 hours of debate, or whether Senator Ted Cruz and some of the conservative senators that are really fighting on this issue will yield back some of that time to speed things along.
Well, when they do move on to the House-passed bill, what are the changes that Harry Reid has said he'd make to that bill?
Yeah, absolutely. So once they get on the bill, the top order of business for the Senate Democrats will be to strip out the health care language in the bill. So right now, of course, the House Republicans sent over this bill with the language that would you know, defund the health care law, the Affordable Care Act. And of course, Senate Democrats are not expected to stand for that, and they will be able to, with just a simple majority vote, to strip that language out. And that, of course, is what Senator Ted Cruz and the Republicans are fighting to prevent.
About the changes that Harry Reid's making, he's also said he's going to shorten the House bill 1 month to the middle of November. What's the purpose of changing the date?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, there is a push by the Senate Democrats to do that because they want to give the appropriators more time to actually get some of the appropriation bills through the Senate. Of course, the House has passed some of its appropriation bills. The Senate is working on theirs. And there's this idea that if they wait until the last minute in December, you know, December 15th, there's not going to be much time to reconcile the differences of those bills. And the idea is if they shorten the continuing resolution, so that means that the government would only be able to operate under this stopgap measure for, you know, until November, that would sort of light a fire to get a little more action on the appropriations bills and maybe see if they could come to some agreement on some spending levels.
Well, assuming some sort of final passage vote, tell us when you think that might be in the Senate in terms of the CR. And looking ahead to the House, what are House leaders saying about a bill that arrives there with the health care defunding stripped out of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, the way the calendar works is the Senate would be on track to get this bill all finished up and done with by Sunday evening. Now, that said, a couple of Republican leaders and other Republicans in the Senate are really pushing to truncate that schedule, have Senator Cruz and his allies yield back some of the time and wrap things up a little quicker. And you saw Senator Cruz make some movements toward that because he would like to have the next, what's called cloture vote, the next sort of key vote on Friday instead of Saturday, because he really wants to be able to capture the American public on this bill and show them what's happening. And he thinks he'll have a better audience Friday than Saturday when, as he said, maybe people are watching football. So we'll see if the senators can come to some agreement to wrap that through sometime earlier than Sunday. So let's say Friday night, maybe at the soonest they could wrap things up. Now, once the bill kicks over to the House, it will be on Speaker Boehner will have to decide whether or not he's going to try to just go ahead and pass the bill as it is without this health care language, which would be very difficult for him because his Republicans in the House will disagree with that, or whether he will try to amend it one more time with maybe a more modest tweak to the health care law and kick it back over to the Senate for one more go of it. That's what really Republicans in both chambers are sort of aiming for now, is to have the bill kick over to the House and have Speaker Boehner attach something else. They're talking about a repeal of the medical device manufacturers tax. This is a tax on those who make medical devices. It's part of the health care law. Some Democrats have supported that in the past, and so the Republicans think they might be able to get Democrats on board to strip that out. They're also talking about a repeal of the individual mandate that requires that all Americans have health insurance coming in the new year. So these are some of the ideas that the Republicans are kicking around to have Speaker Boehner attached to the bill and send it back over to the Senate one more time. I'll tell you, the longer that Senator Cruz and the Republicans in the Senate carry on their fight, the less time that Speaker Boehner has to amend the bill and kick it back. So that's really a calculation that the Republicans have to decide where their best strategy is. That said, we're bumping up against the October 1st deadline to fund the government. So they're really up to the 11th hour here, over the weekend with just a matter of hours, if not, a day, if not hours, to wrap this up.
Lisa Mascaro covers Congress for the Tribune Washington Bureau. You can follow her reporting at places like LATimes.com and follow her on Twitter at Lisa Mascaro in D.C. Thanks for the update.
You bet. Thanks.
And a quick update, Chad Pergram of Fox News tweeting about the CR funding bill we just heard about, saying that talks now ongoing in the Senate to yield back 30 hours post-cloture and try to call up CR tonight. And that could accelerate the process a lot. That from Chad Pergram at Fox News. House Democratic leaders held a news conference today talking about the nation's borrowing limit. In a letter to members of Congress, Treasury Secretary Jack Lew set October 17th as the date when the Treasury will only have $30 billion in cash on hand. He said that without additional borrowing authority, the country would be far short of daily expenditures on certain days, which could be as high as $60 billion. And Mr. Lew said that if that happens, it would be impossible for the U.S. to meet all of its obligations for the first time in history. Here's Minority Leader Pelosi and other House Democratic leaders talking about the debt limit.
Good afternoon. Today it is a pleasure to join my colleagues, our distinguished Democratic whip, Mr. Hoyer, our distinguished assistant leader, Mr. Clyburn, and our champion on this issue of a clean debt ceiling, Congressman Peter Welch, who for years has demonstrated great leadership in lifting the debt ceiling with a clean bill. Indeed, to get nearly every Democrat to sign this letter in a matter of days is quite a remarkable accomplishment. Mr. Hoyer has led the charge to address our economic and fiscal challenges in a balanced way for his whole time in Congress. And Assistant Leader Mr. Clyburn has been a champion for consumers who are very definitely affected. The consumers in our great middle class are greatly affected by a default on the lifting of the debt ceiling, honoring the full faith and credit of the United States of America. The Republican agenda keeps going from bad to worse. The Republicans keep threatening a government shutdown in order to put insurance companies back in charge of America's health care. Now Republicans continue to hold the full faith and credit of the United States government hostage to their radical agenda. This morning, Treasury Secretary Lew, as you know, made it clear that the debt limit will be reached on October 17th. As he wrote in his letter, if we have insufficient cash on hand, it would be impossible for the United States of America to meet all of its obligations for the first time in our history. For the first time in our history. Refusing to raise the debt limit poses a cataclysmic danger, some say worse than cataclysmic danger, to the stability of our markets and the economic security of our middle class. Again, we've talked about this before, but for the American people, the results would be disastrous in this respect. Everyday Americans would be paying higher interest rates on credit cards, mortgage payments, car payments, student loans, and for small businesses, higher interest rates on their business loans. I asked you to raise your hand. I was very pleased last week that some of you did, who has a 401k. chaos in the markets would jeopardize America's 401k accounts, pensions, and other retirement plans. Your 401k in jeopardy because of a radical right-wing agenda that the Republicans are putting forth. Even talk of a default in August of 2011 led to a downgrade. Just even discussion of it slowed economic growth, impacted the markets, and caused consumer confidence to plummet. Fed Chairman Bernanke said a government shutdown, and perhaps even more so, a failure to raise the debt limit, he talked about both, could have very serious consequences for the financial markets and for the economy. Democrats know that Americans cannot afford another Republican-manufactured crisis. That's why we're standing together to support a clean increase in our debt limit so America can pay its bills and avoid another debilitating crisis to our economy. It's time for Republicans to abandon their reckless agenda and for Democrats and Republicans to come together, to work together, to pursue the responsible course, to raise the debt ceiling, to end the sequester, to create jobs, grow the economy, and strengthen the middle class. My colleagues here have all been champions in that regard, and I'm pleased to yield to our champion on getting this letter. I mean, you have no idea how difficult it is over a weekend to get so many signatures, even when we're in session. And so I salute Mr. Welch for his leadership, for his commitment to fiscal soundness in our country, and for the respect he commands in our caucus because they supported him in this letter. Mr. Welch.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here with our leaders, Pelosi, Hoyer, and Clyburn. 186 Democrats, 186 members of the Democratic caucus agree with President Obama and President Ronald Reagan that America pays its bills. And it was President Reagan who said in 1983 that the debt ceiling should not be used as a political football. Raising the debt ceiling is about one thing and one thing only, honoring obligations incurred by previous Congresses, Democratic and Republican. It's not about authorizing a penny of new spending. So the question of the day is, are the Republicans really serious? Are they really serious about defaulting on America's debt for the first time in America's history? If they are, it's really time for them to get real. If they are, it's time for them to sober up. And if they are, their strategy will fail, because the financial markets will pistol whip the Republican conference into doing then what they should be doing now, and that is pay America's bills. Thank you. And I yield to Mr. Hoyer.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman Welch, for your leadership and tenacity on this issue. Peter Welch has been raising this, his voice and the voice of others for years now on behalf of fiscal responsibility. Taking your country hostage and damaging your country should not be an option. That is what's being done by our Republican colleagues. Any attempt to hold our debt limit hostage would be reckless. Those of us who signed Representative Welch's letter are committed to a clean debt limit extension to prevent a default and forestall another downgrade of our credit. That is not an easy vote, because it will be mischaracterized as incurring additional debt. As Mr. Welch so correctly pointed out, the debt limit extension is for that debt which we have already incurred. It was shameful when Republicans brought us to the brink in 2011, leading to the only downgrade of America's credit in history, where Standard & Poor's downgraded us 1 point. The bill Republicans propose to put on the floor this week is nothing but a wish list of unrelated and partisan policies they know won't go anywhere. As a result, they are taking their country's credit hostage to their own small agenda. To provide certainty to our markets, we should act now rather than wait until October 17th. Now, the Republicans apparently may do that this week, but they ought to do a clean debt limit extension, and we ought to stop demagoguing one another. It is for policies the Congress and the President have adopted. We shouldn't be playing political games with our debt, risking severe and fiscal economic consequences. Federal Chairman Bernanke put it bluntly, and I quote, this is September 18th, just a few days ago, "A failure to raise the debt limit could have very serious consequences to the financial markets and for the economy." Now, one could shrug off Mr. Bernanke as perhaps not a partisan, as overly concerned. But Moody's analyst Stephen Hess wrote yesterday on 9/24, the U.S. Treasury bond is the benchmark of the world's financial markets. To default on that would create a global financial problem. Now, you could say, well, he's just a bond rater or something of that nature. But let me call your attention to this quote. Former Bush Director of the Office of Management Budget and Chairman of the Gingrich-led Congress's Budget Committee, Jim Nussle, said this, quote, "Markets will react. There will be repercussions that our economy right now doesn't need and doesn't deserve." He went on to say it would be a dangerous and damaging process to pursue. And so we urge our Republican colleagues to act responsibly, to put country above party, and to end their partisan games and threaten our nation's fiscal health, and which will have real-world repercussions to our economy. The letter that Mr. Welch has put together echoes the President's statement that Congress must act for America to pay its bills. I thank Representative Welch for his leadership on this issue, and we're standing with him today to send a strong message that we must prevent a catastrophic default. And I now yield to the Assistant Leader of the Democratic Caucus in the House, my good friend from South Carolina, Jim Clyburn.
Thank you very much, Whip Hoyer, Leader Pelosi. Mr. Welch, thank you all so much for your leadership on this this issue that is so very, very important to the men and women, especially the working men and women in this great country of ours. I think that all of us recall that back in 2011, when we had tremendous brinksmanship taking place by the other party, some significant things started to happen. Consumer confidence plummeted. And in response to their shenanigans, businesses stopped hiring. And that, to me, led to sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, we can talk all we want about what may or may not happen. But everybody that I've talked to on this and everybody that I've listened to tell me that what is sure to happen is that mortgage rates are going to skyrocket. Not just home mortgages, student loans, and the rate on student loans will skyrocket. But when I think about all the things that could happen and what we read about this, I often just revert to my own experiences. And I was thinking last night about some of our early lessons. Now, I remember being in the 3rd grade, and I remember spelling bees. But aside from those spelling bees, the thing that I remember more than anything else is my dad telling me that what has made this country great and what makes this country run is credit. of all you do, son, he would tell me, you keep your credit clean. He would drill that into us all the time. And I think about those fundamental lessons. And I remember, like I remember those spelling bees, that one phrase that my dad, who, because of the laws in South Carolina, was not allowed to go to high school and finish college after I was around a teenager, used to use a phrase all the time: full faith and credit of the United States of America. He thought that that was so important. And there is nothing, no matter how we may dress it up, there's nothing any more fundamentally important to this great country of ours than us maintaining the good faith and credit of the United States of America. And that is what is being jeopardized by these shenanigans by the other side. And with that, I'll yield back to our great leader.
I thank my colleagues, Mr. Welch, for his leadership over the years and over the weekend in amassing such a strong statement of support for lifting the debt limit in a clean way, for Mr. Hoyer for talking about what the ramifications are globally, and Mr. Clyburn as to what it means to individual Americans. It is really important for us to just put this aside and, again, never question the full faith and credit, because it's about confidence. It's about confidence in our economy as to how jobs are created and how consumers spend and how, again, people buy our bonds, countries buy our bonds, or institutions relate to the federal government. And this is placing it all in doubt. And why? Any questions? Yes, sir.
How much of an increase are you actually looking for? $1 or $2 billion, or $1 trillion, I mean, or are you trying to get this issue settled for the rest of the Obama administration, or maybe ask for something like a $5 trillion increase? Like, how much of an increase in the debt limit? You asked for a clean increase, but is there a dollar amount associated with that?
I don't have a dollar amount, but I think that the Republicans, and I agree with them on this, are looking to get this through the next election. So whatever dollar amount gets you to maybe January of 2015. And the reason for that is, frankly, Mr. Boehner recognizes the irresponsibility of this action and doesn't want to take his party through it a second time in an election year, as he did not the last time, as you recall, in 2011, in which he proposed doing the same thing. I think that's I think that would be a agreed upon objective.
Several of you cited what happened in 2011 and going to the brink with the debt ceiling fight then. Does this feel similar, worse, better? Are you more optimistic this time? I mean, I know all these are struggles, but how does this feel compared to that fight we went through 2 years ago?
Mr. West, would you like to speak to that?
Well, it's worse. You know, that was the first time Congress went from grandstanding on the debt ceiling to actual confrontation. In this Congress, we've had leadership that's led Congress into dysfunction, and we're about to take a step into disintegration. And this year, what you're seeing is people who actually believe that it's a legitimate tactic to blow up the country in order to achieve a goal, which is to get rid of Obamacare. And it's reminiscent of another statement that somebody made in a different context: we'll blow up the country in order to save it. I mean, this is just wild and reckless. There's no legitimate rationale for any member of Congress to destroy or jeopardize, as Jim Clyburn said, the full faith and credit of this country that has such consequences to students, to homeowners, to businesses in order to, quote, get their way, especially when the way they want to get has been decided by the American people in the last presidential election. It was decided by the Supreme Court, and it was decided by Congress. So this is pretty wild behavior on the part of the Republican conference.
How problematic would it be for, in general, to enshrine a precedent where the party out of power can demand reforms and concessions in exchange for lifting the debt ceiling? And for your part, would you commit to not doing any such thing if you're Speaker again under a Republican president?
Let me just speak to that issue in a broader sense, because 5 years ago last week, all of us here were faced with a vote that was a very, very serious one, and that was about passing the TARP bill. A Republican was in the White House. His policies over 8 years produced a meltdown of our financial markets. It increased the deficit enormously. And they came to us at the 11th, 12th hour, really, 12th hour and said, help. And we, as Democrats, went out there and said, time is of the essence. We must
Bill
work.
is passed without objection. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Okay, so I need to... The House will come to order. The House will come to order. Members will take their seats. The House will come to order. What purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order and address the House.
Objection.
Mr. Speaker, none of us ever want to be down here as representatives and as a delegation talking about a disaster in our districts. But last week, Coloradans in an instant lost their homes and businesses, their hopes and dreams, and in some cases, tragically, their lives. Amid the despair and the disaster, people came together, helping dig one another out, the heroism of our sheriff's departments and the National Guard in conducting an airlift of thousands of Coloradans to safety. Today we mourn the tragic loss of life and the lives devastated by the floods. Among those confirmed dead, Evelyn Starner, a nurse and a mother of 3. Jerry Boland, beloved grandfather and retired math teacher and well-known basketball coach at the local high school in Lyons. Danny Davis, father of 5, skilled carpenter and outdoorsman. James Bettner, Broncos fan and family man. Joseph Howlett, the well-known operator of the Jamestown Mercantile Cafe, which I've been to for 18 years. Carol C.T. White, loved stock racing cars and retired from Coors Plant in Golden. Wyanna Nelson and Wesley Quinlan, 19-year-old sweethearts. Wesley, a graduate last year of Centaurus High School in Boulder, Colorado, who was swept away trying to save his girlfriend's life when their car got stuck. And Patty Goodwine, who's still missing, and we pray for her return. I yield to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Gardner.
In Colorado, we lost over 2,000 homes destroyed, over 17,000 homes damaged, over 200 miles of highway washed away. But the incredible work that the first responders have done, local leaders, locally elected officials, firemen, policemen, the stories of their heroic efforts are continuing to emerge, and we cannot thank them enough for the work that they have done in Colorado to save lives, to save property, and what they are doing now to rebuild their communities. And would ask that you would join us in a moment of silence in remembrance of the people who've lost their lives and those who've had their lives forever changed.
Members will please rise. Objection, 5-minute voting will continue. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, to suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 354, in which the yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 354, resolution providing for the concurrence by the House in the Senate amendment to H.R. 527 with an amendment.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to the resolution? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
the last vote of the day on a bill dealing with the National Helium Reserve. The measure changes and then returns to the Senate legislation that allows the reserve to continue selling crude helium after the program's debt is repaid. Congressional Quarterly writes that this prevents the closure of the program on October 7th and a possible helium shortage. The candidates in Virginia's governor's race debate tonight is their second debate, and the Washington Post writes that a pair of polls released this week, one from the Post and the other from NBC News and Marist College, showed Democrat Terry McAuliffe leading by 5 to 8 points over Republican Virginia Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli. Our live coverage of that debate is getting underway right now, live on C-SPAN 3. And in addition to the House and Senate, we'll also have live coverage of CBO Director Doug Elmendorf at the House Budget Committee starting at 10 a.m. Eastern tomorrow on C-SPAN 3. And then later in the day, the Senate Intelligence Committee holds a hearing on the FISA Surveillance Court, including General Keith Alexander, the head of the National Security Agency, and National Intelligence Director James Clapper. That Senate Intelligence Committee hearing gets started at 2 Eastern, also on C-SPAN 3. This vote continues dealing with the Federal Helium Reserve, sending the bill back to the Senate. Funding for the federal agencies runs out at the end of the month, and House and Senate leaders continue to negotiate on a short-term bill to keep the government operating. The Senate voted unanimously today to advance House-passed legislation to defund the health care law and keep the government open. The vote sets the stage for Senate Leader Harry Reid to offer an amendment that would remove the language that defunds the health care law, which we're hearing through a couple of tweets from reporters could happen tonight. The Washington Post writes that a government shutdown next week would jeopardize the paychecks of more than 800,000 federal workers who could be told to stay at home. More than 2 million other employees who are deemed essential would be entitled to their salaries. During the past two shutdowns, when federal workers were furloughed for 5 days in November 1995 and 21 days from December into January of that year, Congress did pass a bill awarding them back pay. But the story in the Washington Post goes on to say that this go-round could be different. The bitterly divided Congress includes many lawmakers who are unsympathetic to the plight of federal workers and could be loath to help them recoup their money. Looking ahead to later in the week, Jonathan Strong of the National Review tweets, House GOP debt ceiling bill could be voted on as early as Saturday. The Hill writes about that bill that House Republicans plan to tie an increase in the debt ceiling to a broad GOP wish list that includes delaying the health care law for a full year. And the list circulating on K Street indicates the GOP also hopes to kickstart tax reform, permit the Keystone XL oil pipeline, and trim a slew of federal regulations in exchange for a borrowing boost. That in the Hill.
On this vote, the yeas are 367, the nays are 0, two-thirds being in the affirmative. The rules are suspended, the resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.